Henry Shakespeare Stevens Salt. He was born in 1851 and he died in 1939. The group that he formed, which is the subject here, it's the Humanitarian League. So Henry Salt is often credited to be first wave animal rights. There is some suggestion that it was more like what might be called new welfarism, but we'll see that transpire as we go along, in the sense that he didn't shy away from bringing about reform as he went, as it were. So we'll see about all that. Just want to show before we start, just switch to this. This is the Henry Salt archive, which is on the net, henrysalt.co.uk. It's a very big archive, as you can see there. It's got stuff about his life, things about him as the author. His book reviews here are really interesting. His friends, we'll come on to his friends a little bit in the story. Then you've got a tab for the Humanitarian League itself and the blog. So that's a really good resource that you could go to. Salt was born in India, very much like Spike Milligan, and he lived to 88 years old. He had a great friendship with quite a lot of pretty important people, including George Bernard Shaw. Shaw, in his usual witty self, said he was the mildest mannered man that ever defied society. So these are a rundown of his important books. It's only a selection. You can go to that archive to see all of them, but these are the ones that are important in terms of us. So A Plea for Vegetarianism. I mean, obviously this is before veganism, and in fact I'm going to show you some interaction that Watson had with his work a little later. Flesh or Fruit, an essay on food reform. And then the big one in terms of animal rights theory, animal rights considered in relation to social progress. That book is still available online, I believe. There's talk of a second edition, which might have never been published, but that's an interesting one to kind of chase down. The Logic of Vegetarianism, Humanities of Diet, and then a brilliantly named autobiography, which is called 70 Years Among Savages. In terms of his influence, it was pretty widespread, not least Gandhi was inspired to look at vegetarianism because of Salt's work. And he said, Salt's book, Plea for Vegetarianism, whetted my appetite for dietetic studies. I went in for all the books available on vegetarianism and read them. So that was from Gandhi's own autobiography. So he was a self-confessed rationalist and socialist, a pacifist and humanitarian. He was influenced by Darwin very much, and in particular in terms of the Darwinian idea of we are different from other animals in degree, rather in kind. So that was an important part of Salt's position. Mark Gold, in this book here, Animal Century, said that Salt was a very rare combination. He said he was a formidable intellect, he was a very talented writer, and an inspired campaigner, all coming together in one person, as it were. I always mention as a sociologist quite often that people are a product of their time, and with that in mind, there is a kind of language warning sometimes. For example, in the days when Salt was writing, they would talk about lower animals and sometimes beasts, creatures, those kind of things. As ever with my audience, I kind of think that, we're mature enough to understand that people are a product of their time, and so therefore they wrote in a particular way, and often in a sexist way, talking about man meaning humanity, of course. That's the big one in that sense. Latching on to this idea, Mark Gold said that it takes an enormous leap of imagination to comprehend how different the world was at the beginning of the 20th century. And I do really think that is true. In fact, I often make that case when it comes to the middle of the century or close, when it comes to the foundation of the vegan social movement. We have to put ourselves in their place, as it were, to understand their worldview, and often to understand how radical their position was. Gold goes on to say, for example, that cars and electricity, This is for the vast majority. Telephones, radios, other taken for granted things were beyond understanding, as he puts it at the time. Women were still to fight for their votes, and the rights of children were hardly considered. So this again kind of situates Salt in his historical setting, really. He was born amongst the privileged classes in the Victorian age. He was educated at Eton, as many of the British MPs are, for example, and then King's College, Cambridge. So we're into the kind of upper echelons of the education system. He excelled academically and was in fact then invited to become a master at Eton himself after being a student there. This is a very young-looking Salt as a master at Eton. When he joined Eton as a master, he becomes a vegetarian, which was probably quite a radical thing to do at the time. He was also a socialist, and Gold talks about him being a committed socialist. And this rather puts him at odds with both his class situation and his position at work. He wasn't really to last too long there, and in fact started to launch a campaign against them after he'd left. He left Eton then in 1884 or 1885. There's some dispute about that. And he, with his wife, rented a labourer's cottage in Surrey. And their plan was to live a very simple life. Dr. Ware, which was Eton's headmaster at the time, said that Salt's resignation was due to, quote, the incendiary combination of socialism and legumes, which I always think is a pretty fantastic quote. Deb, it makes you think about what future generations will think about our lifestyles. Well, it is interesting. I mean, it's important, isn't it, for people to recognize that, you know, things change generationally, and that when you do look back, and, you know, I'm sure people in the future are going to look back. In fact, as vegans, we often hope, don't we, that they're going to look back and think, you know, how did they do that? How did they consume other animals and think that's okay? How did they exploit and oppress other animals? So they will look back in horror, presumably, at what we do now in the way that we look back. I mean, if you ever go to these museums with medieval torture equipment, you tend to think, you know, how is that even possible? And yet it was. So this is Michael Hollyrod's book on George Bernard Shaw and this incendiary combination of socialism and legumes. This one is actually one of the things that Salt said when he left Eton. He wasn't very complimentary. You know, as I said, his autobiography was 70 Years Amongst Savages. He called the Eton setup cannibals in cap and gown, almost literal cannibals, as devouring the flesh and blood of animals, and indirectly cannibals, living by the sweat and toil of the classes that do the hard work of the world. And so you can see just from that one quote how he really didn't fit in with where he was a master. So they moved to Surrey, as I said, and they had no servants there, which was virtually unheard of at the time for their class of person. And then we get into the campaigning part of Salt's life. He forms the Humanitarian League in 1891, and he remains the secretary of the League for its 28 years existence. And it's, in fact, the First World War that ends the existence of the League. The manifesto of the League was truly remarkable, setting out, and again, that warning about the language of the time, to destroy the time-honored ideal of a hard and fast line, as he put it, between white man and black man, rich and poor, the educated and uneducated, and to dispel the idea that there is any difference in kind, again, this Darwinian idea, between human and non-human intelligence. In terms of the aspirations of the Humanitarian League, you can see that it was incredibly kind of radical for its time. He said that human and animal emancipation were two reforms that were inseparable, and that neither can be fully realized alone, which is a sentiment that Donald Watson was to repeat later. But Salt was famous for saying this quote about it's not this bloodshed or that bloodshed, it's all bloodshed, or all wanton or needless bloodshed that must end. In fact, in terms of one of our time tunnels is the 1989 debate, which is the full debate featuring Tom Regan, of course, which took place at the British Institute. And one of the contributions from the floor was by David Icke, of all people, who was then representing the Green Party. And he quoted Salt. He only talks for about 4 or 5 minutes, but it's really quite powerful. And he used that particular quote. So the idea is then that you've got this issue that our emancipation is going to be wrapped up in everyone else's emancipation. And as I said, this is a sentiment that Donald Watson was to repeat years ago. So if you look at this page, I don't know if I can see if I can make it a little bit bigger for you. If you look at the second column, this is where Watson is saying, now nearly half a century later, with our increased knowledge and experience, we can see what pressing human problems are related to problems of other animals, he's saying. They will be solved together or not at all, and that veganism will be central to their solution. So this is Watson picking up on Salt's position, which essentially is what David Nybert expressed in this idea of entanglements, of oppression and liberation. If you are one of the new breed of animals-only vegans, do consider that you're rather out of step with the history of the movement, because it's the idea that we can't liberate one without liberating all. We can't leave anyone else behind, otherwise it's just not going to work. And this has been expressed time and time and time again in our movement, as it was by Salt, as it was by Watson here. Now, the other interesting part of this is a little bit earlier in this same little snippet, which actually is from 1989, when Donald Watson was doing his presidential kind of log, it was called at the time. But he was quite critical of Henry Salt. And so this is quite interesting from us as vegans, in the sense that Henry Salt, from even the titles of his books, was very kind of focused on vegetarianism. And he actually was quite critical of the moves towards non-dairy vegetarianism and also what would become veganism. And in fact, he even called them cock and bull arguments of those opposed to the use of milk and eggs. And Watson said it was but a repeat of what Edward Maitland had written in 1875, that farmyard operations, such as castration, were justified because they allowed the other animals to live a useful life. This view was greeted with silence by the vegetarian movement, a silence that prevailed until we broke it in 1944, not before time. So this is quite an interesting little historical comment from Watson. So it would appear that Salt was a radical reformer and yet would have been opposed to veganism. And of course, the reference to 44 is the reference to the birth and the foundation of the social movement, which came to be called veganism. According to Gold, Salt really was an abolitionist, but he was one of those abolitionists who nevertheless saw the wisdom of pragmatism. So we've got elements of that in the modern day movement, the kind of pragmatic suggestion that we could maybe get involved with a whole series of welfare reforms, and that would then lead to abolition. There's lots of problems with that stance, as many in the chat will know. But apparently Salt was one of those. For example, in the logic of vegetarianism, he said that we are content to get rid of the worst evils first. So we've got this incrementalism idea. Salt argued it is necessary to push steadily towards the ideal situation with a faithful adherence to the right line of reform. At least that would imply that you, as it were, are honest about your end game. You tell people what you want, but then you say, well, you might be able to get a series of steps to get there. So we're in familiar territory in vegan education here, in the sense that, do you hide the fact that veganism is what we want, as some vegan strategists would recommend? Or do we say, well, yeah, the end goal is veganism, but there might be steps towards there. And in that sense, you can take the steps that you feel comfortable with, but we're going to explain that veganism is the end goal. It would seem that Salt was a little bit more in the step-by-step kind of baby step position. That foolishly grasping for the ideal was like a child crying for the moon. And so I think, given that someone like Gary Francione would suggest that this is a very early form of what he would come to call new welfarism. But other people saw that Salt was very, very radical. This is sociologist Keith Tester, and he says that Salt was responsible for an epistemological break, which just really means rupture, with his publication Animal Rights. In essence, Salt brought a new way at looking at human, non-human relations. And in that sense, you could accept that Salt was extremely radical. He saw other animals as individuals, a radical thing in itself, and said that all individuals should ungrudgingly respect the individuality of others, that no human is justified in thinking of other animals as automatons to be worked or to be eaten. In that sense, a very, very radical position. Tester suggests that from Salt's position, nearly every existing human treatment of other animals was, or still is, bad. Although Salt did seem to favor the keeping of pets, and that would have been the word used to talk about them at the time. It's when Salt talks about how domestic animals should be treated with courtesy and fairness is when we maybe can begin to wonder about whether Salt's animal rights is actually really the idea of the right to welfare, or whether it's really animal rights. So there's that question mark hanging over Salt. But as I said, I'm not trying to take away from the radicalism of the time. That's the last thing I want to do. And in terms of the League's program, the Humanitarian League's program of reforms, it was pretty remarkable. For example, this is almost like their rundown of what they were campaigning about. So they campaigned against hunting, inhumane treatment of human prisoners, vivisection, the use of other animals in fashion, we'll come on to that, the treatment of the mentally ill, farmed other animals, corporate punishment, slaughterhouse reforms, which is one thing that you could think is that abolitionist, is that welfare, that kind of thing, and warfare as opposed to welfare. Described as a systematic protest against the numerous barbarisms of the age. And again, in that sense, very radical. The cruelties inflicted by men on men, and the still more atrocious ill treatment of the lower animals, as it was put in those days. That's an interesting one in the sense that wasn't frightened, if you like, to put things into perspective. What humans do to other humans is absolutely appalling, but an even bigger problem is what's called the atrocious ill treatment of other animals. He called for humans to adopt a consistent position towards the right of men and of lower animals alike. Again, this language issue, as I keep saying. And to cultivate a broad system of universal justice for all living beings, which is pretty good. So that there on the right there is the manifesto of the Humanitarian League. The Humanitarian League has been established in the belief that the promulgation of a high and positive system of morality in the conduct of life and all its aspects is one of the greatest needs of the time. It will assert as the basis of that system an intelligible and consistent principle of humaneness, viz., that it is iniquitous to inflict suffering directly or indirectly on any sentient being, except when self-defense or absolute necessity can be justly pleaded. Then there's a quote from Wordsworth. Going back to modern day vegan times, I think that that sentiment is actually the same sentiment that's in the modern day definition of veganism. In other words, the practicable and possible part when absolutely necessary, like in self-defense, or when it's a necessity which is absolute. Whereas, as we know in recent times, the vegan ideal and the use of those kind of words within the modern day definition have been kind of used to some degree of what you could say slippage or sloppiness, if you like. So in their first year, the Humanitarian League launched a campaign against the Royal Buckhounds, which was a deer hunt, but it took them 10 years to close them down. They also took on the Eton School Beagle Pack, so in other words, Salt's old school, and that campaign had the support of Christabel Pankhurst, a militant suffragette, as she was called. Joanna, I guess if Salt lived in this time, he would say companion animals instead of pets. Yes, or he might say animal companions, which is even better than companion animals. The phrase companion animals seem to give them a job, whereas animal companions doesn't. So there's been that progression. It was about the 1980s when companion animal came in, and maybe in the last few years, animal companions has superseded that as well. So they launched this campaign against the Beagle Pack in Eton, and Pankhurst was involved, this militant suffragette. And it's during that campaign that the word blood sports was coined. So that's quite interesting because Salt had a lot to do with the foundation of the League Against Cruel Sports. But the campaign failed. Their London Zoo campaign came off a little better, although this is very reformist, because pythons and other large serpents were being fed live ducks and rabbits and even goats, all in front of visitors. We can say a few things about that, because if it's going on and it's in front of the paying visitors of a zoo, do we have a campaign to hide it or to stop it or what? I mean, if you're going to have pythons and other large serpents in captivity, you've got a problem to feed them, essentially. In 1907, the zoo stopped this practice, and to this day, freshly killed other animals are fed to the reptiles instead. So again, to what extent that's a major victory, we could debate, in the sense that we still have this problem of providing food for obligate carnivores. Gold claims that this was a perfect example of Salt being pragmatic in order to make things less barbaric. Another campaign was against the murderous millinery business, which is the use of bird feathers in hats. Now, but just going back to the zoo issue, making things less barbaric. So I presume we'd have to discover how the other animals are freshly killed compared with what happened to them when live rabbits, for example, were put in with these huge serpents and pythons. Is that going to be worse and more barbaric than humans killing them? It's a debating point, obviously. So another campaign then was this use of birds in fashion, and in particular used in hats. In fact, I don't know whether you can see the insert. I'll see if I can make it a little bit bigger. The insert has actually got a crow's head as well as the feathers embedded into that piece of fashion work, if you like. And millions of birds were massacred for this particular trade. The main picture is the Easter Parade of 1911. In Britain, in 1894, for example, Britain imported about 25 million slaughtered birds just to be put on hats. Albatrosses were very popular, but also herons, hummingbirds, parrots, and canaries were all among the victims of this particular trade. The rich favoured exotic species of birds. The poor often resorted to sparrows and kingfishers. This campaign was responsible for the birth of the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds and was supported by the RSPCA, Punch, the satirical magazine, and the Times. In fact, I was trying to find out whether this picture was from Punch. It looks a bit punchy, but I'm not quite sure where it is. A bill was drafted to ban taking feathers from certain species of birds. So we're into the difficulty of banning things through a speciesist politics. This failed to get through Parliament. So instead, an act to regulate what was called then the plumage trade came in instead. So we went from trying to ban to try to regulate. But it took another 21 years to get the regulation in place. The League also tried an anti-fur campaign, with Salt coming up with the witty line, "One man, one skin." That campaign failed. Mark Gold points out, of course, that fur was very, very fashionable at that particular time of history, more so than now, I would think. But in terms of their notable achievements, the first seemed to be the banning of using birch in flogging in the Royal Navy. The Court of Appeal was established with the help of the Humanitarian League, so that was quite an achievement, really. General prison reforms in the 1898 Prisons Act was part and parcel of their achievements. 1908, the provision of British national parks in Snowdonia, where I used to live, the Lake District and the Scottish Highlands and the Peak District around the Midlands, North Midlands area, I suppose. This was to preserve in the wilderness the cherished property of the people, they called it. So again, that's quite an interesting history of achievements. In terms of other animals, the provision of the national parks was incredibly important. And possibly in terms of culture too, maybe changing people's attitude towards other animals, their protection, their habitats, those kind of ideas. Salt also sought to protect mountains, was interested in protecting plains and heathlands, woods and marshes, and also the seashore. And he said that he wants to protect all those, and this is a very modern sounding claim, these need protection from the greed of developers and the destruction of machines, he said. He also opposed the picking of wild flowers and the pouring of chemical wastes into streams and rivers. So you can imagine what he would be thinking in modern day terms about the intensive farms and their leakage into waterways. Okay, so in 70 Years Amongst Savages, Salt declared that humanitarianism is not merely an expression of sympathy with pain, but it is a protest against all tyranny and desecration, including the vandalism which can ruthlessly destroy the natural grace of the earth. Again, if you saw that debate in 1989 that I mentioned, the British Institute one, you'll see that Richard Ryder, in his opening speech, he talked about the vandalism of blood sports. And it's pretty clear that he probably got that, I would think, from Salt. The RSPB's founders were female, Emily Williamson and Lisa Phillips, before women even had a vote. So thanks for that observation. In Saviour of Salt, this is an anthology. It's published in 1989. While we are willing to spend vast sums on grabbing other people's territories, we have not, of course, a penny to spare for the preservation of our own. And he responded to pushback against his arguments. And again, in that other resource, you can see quite a lot of reviews of his work. He responded to the pushback to that kind of thing with wit and some scorn, probably aided and abetted by George Bernard Shaw. For example, it wasn't long before people started to ask what would become of other animals if he achieved his aim of widespread vegetarianism. And this is where he responds with one of his most mocking statements. He had this vision of the grievous wanderings of homeless herds of cows, this is, who can find no kind protector to eat them. and that was in the Humanities of Diet. On the question of what we should do without leather, Salt responded in a similar way. He said that this presents a lurid picture of a world left shoeless by an instantaneous conversion to vegetarianism. Now, we know that the vegan social movement came into being in the last years of World War II in 1944. The Humanitarian League's demise, according to Mark Gold, came about with the advent of the Great War. In fact, the League closed its doors 1 year into World War I, in other words, 1919. And Henry Salt wrote to a friend not long before he died, aged 88, suggesting that the Humanitarian League had failed, and it had probably failed because he thought it might have been 100 to 2 years too early. He said that the Humanitarian League, Salt said this, was way ahead of any religion of its day, and also its vision was also clearer than any scientist of the day. His legacy, as I've suggested, was pretty impressive. We've seen that Gandhi went vegetarian due to Salt's influences, but there was many others too. Ramsay MacDonald, for example, he went on to become the first Labour Prime Minister in Britain. G.K. Chesterton, the writer and philosopher, etc. George Meredith, novelist and Victorian poet. Sidney and Beatrice Webb, they were socialist, economists, reformers, early members of the Fabian Society linked with left-wing politics, Labour Party, etc. And George Bernard Shaw, playwright. As well as mild-mannered, as we said at the beginning, Shaw described Salt as original and unique. And then finally, if we think of the organizations that were probably was inspired or was part and parcel of the formation was because of the Humanitarian League, then the RSPCA would be one candidate. Friends of the Earth, certainly the Vegetarian Society, Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, the Howard League for Penal Reform, Amnesty International, and the Council for the Protection of Rural England. So as you can see from that, a remarkable roster. Right, people, thank you very much then for tuning in to yet another vegan time tunnel as we build our archive. So thanks very much for joining us, and we'll see you again. Thanks a lot.